Welcome to our next talk in this wonderful series with John Behr on the early church fathers. Last time, John gave us a wonderful trip through the great Irenaeus, the 2nd century church father who lived in France, and he developed Irenaeus's epic view of the stages of growth through the Christian life. In this talk, John is going to jump ahead to the profound church father, the father who was actually called the father of the fathers. So in a way, amongst certainly the Greek fathers, he was regarded long after his death as, the Abraham or Moses of the early church fathers, and that's Gregory of Nyssa. Now, Gregory wrote in the 4th century, so around about 370 AD, and unlike Irenaeus, who lived in France, Gregory lived in Cappadocia, which is modern-day Turkey. The work in question is one of his great works, and honestly, I don't think I personally have never read any work of theology that's influenced me and inspired me as much as this one. Traditionally, it's called On the Making of Man. The translation that's available on Amazon for $20 or whatever is actually a 19th century translation. John recently has published, and unfortunately it costs a bomb, like over $300, a signature new translation. And not just a translation, but a commentary. And it's a beautiful book if you want to buy it, because it's got the Greek on one page and the English on a facing page with a lot of very deep textual notes. But as much as anything else, what has distinguished John's translation is his commentary on it, his interpretation of it, which we'll get onto in a moment. So that's what John's talk is going to be about. Now, I've agonised over this a bit because this talk goes for an hour and a quarter, and at our conference it was obvious that everybody loved it and got lost in it. I mean, no fault of John's. There's a problem we have here, and the problem's an opportunity, which is this, that in an hour he is giving us an introduction to two of the greatest philosophical figures in world history, Plato and Gregory of Nyssa. And he's layering them on top of each other. So it isn't as if we've just got one complex, profound thinker to unravel. We've got two, and how they relate to each other, how there's a certain deliberate irony in the way that Gregory builds on Plato. Now, I'm really personally quite familiar with the book On the Making of Man. As some of you know, I'm doing a second PhD on the human image of God, and I'm quite likely to centre it around this particular book. So I'm thinking about it deeply and talking to John about it quite a lot. So what I've decided to do is actually give you a longer introduction than normal. It might be 30 minutes or so by the time I finish, because I think that introduction will help give you an architecture to absorb the talk. And honestly, you'll probably have to listen to it a couple of times. Good question, is it worth the effort? And I think it is profoundly worth the effort. Profoundly worth the effort because we have here, I think, a question for our age today, which is, what does it mean to be a human being? And we have a tremendous role model in how to answer that question, not just profoundly, but drawing on the joint resources of philosophy and scripture, which is what Gregory does. So this introduction will, in a sense, be a précis, and then in a few days' time we'll release John's actual talk. So, opening point. By the way, John does not call it On the Making of Man. There's some argument over exactly what title originally appertained to the work, And for a variety of reasons, John goes with on the human image of God, which is significant, on the human image of God. So here's an opening point which helps understand the tone of the work and the style of the work, and why the style of the work in itself is rather contrasting to what we might be used to today in our Christian theology. The opening point is that, according to John, this 4th century was the golden age of theology in a way. It was the golden age because it was still an era of open thought, of inquiry, an era of inquiry, not doctrinal categories. What happened in the 5th and 6th century is that doctrine kind of hardened up and got codified by councils and ratified, and, as it were, introduced the modern, much more formulaic descriptions of what Christianity means. Gregory lived in an era before that happened where there was still an open inquiry that was framed by a sense of the vast mystery that we're involved in creation, the vast mystery that we're involved in thinking about God. And why the 4th century? What did it have over the 2nd century, for instance? Well, John's point is that in the earlier centuries, the church was fighting for its existence. So it was much more apologetic, much more defensive. The 4th century is characterised by more peace, more time to think, more time to reflect. So it's a kind of the mature golden age of the open thinking of the church. And in that age, Gregory was, if not the dominant figure, a dominant figure. The other point that I think makes this work really unique, it's absolutely what today in modern terms we'd call cross-disciplinary thinking. When you read this, it's quite clear that Gregory's mind did not sit in boxes. He didn't have a religious box and then a philosophical box and so on. Like his brothers and friends, Gregory of Nazianzus, Peter the Great, and Basil the Great, their minds were highly educated, but they were polymaths. And they saw no boundaries to where God works. They saw no boundaries. Now, even in their own day, that was considered rather dangerous and free thinking. But what rooted and anchored them was an enormous fear of the Lord, I suppose I'd put it that way. Proverbs says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And their whole minds were walled in, the boundaries, the horizons, the topography of their minds was formed by the fear of the Lord, and in particular by a vast, all-pervasive appreciation of the Logos, of Christ as the architect of all reality. So, in this work on the making of man, or in the human image of God, John Behr's major point is that Gregory is basing his work deliberately on Plato's great work, the Timaeus. That's not a fanciful claim, because in one of his other great works on the soul and the resurrection, clearly Gregory is taking the style of a Platonic dialogue. It's a Socratic dialogue, in that case between him and his sister, Macrina. This one's not a dialogue. It's something else. It's more of a modelling on the structure of the Timaeus. Now, why would he do that? He did it because the Timaeus was the profound work of cosmology and anthropology in the ancient world. And it's a work that was very influential. So rather than rejecting it as pagan, Gregory took it as a stepping stone into the gospel. And it was done in a way that was indirect, because he's not actually explicitly anywhere saying he's doing that, but he's modelling the argument of Plato, not to diminish Plato, but to stand on his shoulders and with the help of scripture and revelation go further. I think we can learn a lot from that today, that it's really an Acts chapter 17 capability to be able to position the gospel in the best of contemporary thought. Now, that's going to be a problem for you as you listen, because there's a fairly large opening part where John goes through the structure of the Timaeus, and the Timaeus itself is a profound work. I mean, it's really interesting and difficult and idiosyncratic. And in a way, you could almost skip that whole part of John's argument. I mean, I think it's very important, but it's almost like an advanced stage, that sort of assumes you've understood what Gregory's doing and have read his work. So note to self, as you listen, you could actually, don't get yourself too caught up in worrying about Plato and the Timaeus. And later in my introduction, I'll give you a timing as to when he introduces the Timaeus and as an introductory section, and when he leaves it and goes on to Gregory. So what's the theme of Gregory's work, and how does that theme connect with Irenaeus? Broadly, the theme is, what does it mean to be a human being? It's Hamlet's great speech, what a piece of work is man. It's written with a sense of wide-eyed wonder at the human experience. The way that it's thematically connected to Irenaeus, well, John actually explains that at the end, but in short, both Irenaeus and Gregory saw the human life and the Christian life through the paradigm of growth, not through the paradigm of a moral forensic contest. So within that framework, salvation, quote unquote, is not primarily seen as a legal issue, as a transactional issue, as forgiveness from a guilt. Salvation is seen as participation in the divine life, of which, I mean, they absolutely had theories of sin. They absolutely had theories of forgiveness, but they were subordinated to the big picture. And the big picture is growth. Both Irenaeus and Gregory saw that as the paradigm. Now, it's a paradigm. What we've tended to do in reform circles is somewhat make growth a post-scripta conversion. I get converted, then I grow. They did not see it that way. They saw it as central to the creation from Genesis 1. Not a reaction to sin, not a plan B. It was the ultimate plan of God for the created order. Now, you have to hang on to that theme, because that is the salient feature that absolutely changes the perspective that Gregory and Irenaeus and others had in the early church fathers on our Christian faith. Irenaeus looked at growth through the 7 stages of life through humanity. It was a wonderful talk, I think you'll agree. And his analogical paradigm was, the growth of an individual. Gregory does the same thing, but he looks at all humanity as a corporate body through the stages of growth, and he moves in this work to a very firm eschatological focus, the end of the cosmos. And then what he does in the heart of the work is a deep dive into what growth means. And his key model for growth is a twofold identity of humanity. That humans are what he calls a compound creature. Compound. And now, in traditional Christianity, there is a sense of twofoldness. And the twofoldness that you will hear often is a construct between holiness and sin. So that's the dualism that within which the gospel is framed in modern terms. That was not what Gregory had in mind at all. The twofoldness, which he will find deeply in Genesis 1, verses 26 and 27, is as follows, that the human being strides across two worlds, the divine and the created. That's the twofoldness. And the tension and paradox that's inherent in that is not in itself evil. It's not in itself problematic. It's the beginning of a journey. And he never ever sees the temporal side of humanity as something to be discarded, gotten rid of, so we go up into the spiritual side. He is not in that dualistic world in the slightest. It's incredibly integrative. So he sees that, and what happens in this is primarily developed in chapter 16 of his book on the making of man. By the way, these chapters are really short. Chapter 16's only about 5 pages long. Mind you, it's 5 pages where every clause has you thinking. It's very, very crafted and succinct thinking. But the model is, and this is the heart of Gregory's model, that humanity is made after an eternal template. We are made after the shape of the divine. So when it says we're made in the image of God, that's what he says. And furthermore, for Gregory, that is the distinctive, unrelenting purpose of God. That's what defines what it means to be a human being, the eternal template. And the template or the prototype after which we are made is the Logos. We are in creation, miniature Christs. The second part of our nature is that we are temporal. We're actually, not because of sin, we're made, created. And it's very important to understand this. I mean, I think we've probably, in a sloppy way as Reformed thinkers or just general modern Christian thinkers, thought that to be temporal is somehow or other the result of sin. Church fathers never thought that. To be temporal is to be created, and to be created is to be made in change, because we went from non-existence into existence. That was the huge transformation. Our temporality is actually part of us being part of a created as opposed to uncreated order. So within the temporality, we've now got change. It's actually part of it, and change is not a bad thing. I mean, sure, sin enters and messes things up, but at heart, change is part of the created order. So therefore, there is a part of us, part of humanity that is, as it were, essential and a shadow of the temporal and the unchanging. And there's part of us that's part of a developing reality, and that development is a growing up into the divine. That's the big picture which he shares with Irenaeus. And furthermore, in humanity's growing up, we're bringing the cosmos with us up into God, up into the divine. That's our job. That's the mandate of humanity. So God's purpose in humanity is to bring the two worlds together, heaven and earth together, to bring to synthesize the divine, the uncreated, and the created. Well, I hope that overview really helps you, because thematically that's the paradigm within which they're working all the time. What John talks about is how Gregory develops that through 3 stages, which is natural. And John doesn't say this, but it's actually a Trinitarian structure which would appeal to me. I presume it appealed to Gregory. In other words, phase 1 is looking at the divine beauty of humanity. Phase 2 is looking at temporality and the issues with temporality and growth. And phase 3 is, well, how do we bring them together in the consummation of all things? That's loosely the threefold flow he sees in the making of man. And that's the flow that he says is patchworked on to exactly the same flow in Plato's Timaeus. Well, that's my best effort at giving you the big themes. Let me help you with a metaphor, because metaphors help me a lot to understand these complex things. And by the way, if you read Gregory, he was a great user of metaphor and analogy, and they're really illuminating when he uses them. The other thing you'd see if you actually read Gregory, he's incredibly humble. As he's speculating, he'll often, when he's really moving up into the heavens, he will stop and say something like, well, only the truth, capital T, really knows these things. Or one can only know these things if, like Paul, one's been caught up into the third heaven, but I'll give it a go anyway. He says that explicitly several times in this work. Here's the metaphor that helps me. And it's not far from the range of metaphors that Gregory uses. Think about building a house. Building a house. Now, when you build a house, you have a plan. Now, that word plan, before you build it, so all of your thought goes into the creation of a plan. So something exists before the reality of the house exists. We call it a plan. The plan's a product of our mind. A plan, however, means 2 things that are actually very, very different. One is a 2-dimensional schematic specification of the finished product. That's the architect's drawings. So before anything exists, or before anything can exist, there is, from the mind of the architect, and it's generally 2-dimensional looking down, or else it's 2-dimensional looking across. It's a 3D image of what's the finish going to look like. And if you think about that, that's actually imagining the end before the beginning, completed. It's also, by the way, if you think about it, a picture in space, not time. This actually will be useful for you when you get into some of the philosophy of space and time that Gregory alludes to. So 2D drawings have no temporal aspect to them. They're just, as it were, an idealistic spatial specification. This is what we want built. The second thing a plan can mean, equally frequently used, is a process of the project. You know, step 1, we'll lay the foundation. Step 2, we'll do this. Step 3, we'll do this. Step 4, we'll do that, and so on, like a Gantt chart or a flow chart. And the heart of that is temporal. It's moving through time. And you need them both. You need them both. If all you had was a project planned through time, you don't know where on earth you're going. If all you've got is a template, how am I going to build that template? You actually need both, and they work together. They're not either ors. One is not greater than the other. They work together, and when they're finished, they're both laid aside. They're both bits of paper and computer programs we could just lay aside, because now we've got the reality, and the reality is the actual house as a new experience. So that metaphor actually works really well in what we're talking about, where the house that God is building is the cosmos with us at the center of it. So we're the house. And what Gregory sees in Genesis one is both things. He sees the what I call the eternal model, i.e. the 2 to 3D specification. This is the prototype. This is what I want. And that prototype is an image of Christ, who is the architect and logos of all reality. But we exist in time. So in order to get there, there's a passage of time. There is a sequencing, a temporality, procreation, growth, etc., which Gregory finds in the second half of Genesis 1, where it says, male and female created he them. And he talks about that a lot, and John talks about that a lot. Along the lines of the fact that maleness and femaleness, we know, are not properties of God. They're properties of humanity and properties we share with creation, but not properties of God. So they don't define our humanity. Our humanity is defined by the eternal prototype. So if you keep that image in mind, it certainly helped me a lot, and to understand how all this hangs together. Now, let me finish by giving you the overall flow of the talk, time stamping as it were. So the opening of about 9 minutes or so, John will remind us about Irenaeus and what we covered with Irenaeus, and talk a little bit about that golden age of open thinking that I alluded to earlier. Then, around about the 9th minute, he moves on to Plato and makes his big point that he's pretty positive that Gregory deliberately was imitating the structure and arrangement of the Timaeus to give, as it were, a Christian Timaeus to the world. And the theme of the Timaeus, and he'll keep using these words quite a lot, is the mixed world. It's a mixed world between what Plato called the intellect and necessity. So they're not words we would use today in quite that way, so I want to just help you with them a little bit. So the intellect is that ideal. So I think as human beings we can really actually understand this if we use other language. We live our life walking between quote unquote reality and hopes. We all do that. We live our life, and I think Kierkegaard said, between imagination and experience. So we are teleological creatures, and that means in our minds we have a vision of possibility. But we've then got the grapple with reality, the day-to-day battle and contest to get somewhere. So they're parallel synonyms really for what Plato is grappling with when he talks about reality being defined by intellect and necessity. By the way, there's another aspect of that that's really important. Another aspect of that could be between mind and body, where the mind, thinks in pure terms, but the body is what connects us to age, movement, procreation, etc. And that's actually quite a big theme. The one thing which I would just, if you read Gregory, is absolutely noticeable, is he has a totally integrated view, as did Plato, of body and mind, unlike Descartes, who really pulled body and mind apart and gave us the dualism that the modern world lives in. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary how Gregory talks about, for instance, the physiognomy of our face and the way it's set up so that we can talk. Or our hands, how we can use our hands to gesture while we talk and think. We're not like a cow that has to, muzzle the earth. He sees every part of our physicality is actually integral to. It's a vehicle for our rationality. It's an extraordinarily integrated image. Anyway, I won't go further into that. Now, humanity's job is to unite both of those worlds, to bring the intellect and the necessity together, or in Gregory's terms, heaven and earth together. That's our job. And there's a beautiful word that John emphasises, a word that he chooses to translate as the span or the bridge. Humanity is the span between the divine, the eternal, and the created. I mean, a little bit of reflection makes that quite real, because I've often thought, and I think some of the church fathers said the same thing, well, our mind actually is eternal, because in our mind there are no boundaries. Our mind can go anywhere quite happily, and does, in terms of space and time. So that then will take us through, after the bit on Plato, to the 15-minute mark, and he then introduces Gregory and explains why Gregory wrote the work. And that's actually quite important. He wrote it to finish his brother's great work on Genesis 1. Basil the Great had written a great book on Genesis 1. We've got it. I've only read bits of it. It's pretty profound, pretty wonderful. But he'd been through Genesis 1, but he died before he could do the last day of the creation of humanity. So his brother Gregory is finishing that work off. And therefore the focusing question is, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? What is humanity? So John has a fair time explaining that background. And then at around about the half an hour mark, 32 minutes in, we now dive into the actual text. And the first part is the high view of humanity, the grand, noble, inspiring view of humanity in very poetic terms that Gregory talks about, and John unpacks that. And it's really inspiring stuff. In Gregory's text, that's chapters 1 to 15. And as I said, these chapters are pretty short. Some of them are only 2 pages long. And really what Gregory is developing is the way humanity is participating in intellect. That's a point really strongly. He's not saying we've got it and it's independent, but in our intellect and rationality, we're participating with God. We don't own this faculty, we're sharing it. And as I've just mentioned, our body, far from competing with it, actually expedites that kind of thinking. There's a little section at the 34-minute mark on the nature of evil, because you can obviously hear this very optimistic grand picture of humanity and think, yeah, but what about the fall? What about evil? And at the 34-minute mark, just for 2 or 3 minutes, John covers how Gregory covers that. Again, that's gold. That 3 minutes is gold, because you will see that Gregory does not have the same conception of evil and sin that we do as a forensic guilt, as the stain of original sin, as some toxic infection. Not in his thinking in the slightest. Leave you to listen to it to find out what is in his thinking. Then after he's finished that little section, the 37th minute, he introduces now part 2, which is the yes but, where what about necessity? What about misery? Because he opens up this section saying, well, look, I know this sounds optimistic, but if we just look around, life isn't like this. How can we be in the image of God, where we grow old, we die, there's sickness, there's wars, there's death? And that's actually how chapter 16 opens. So that's part 2, where Gregory has to confront that issue. And he confronts it in a way that is absolutely different to the way we might normally confront it. And I hope I can capture this for you. You can ask that question about misery and evil from 2 perspectives. Bottom up, which is the way I think we're all used to it. Oh yeah, this is a great, and people have said this to me, that's a great picture, fine, but what about evil? What about Hitler? What about, and you look around, looking as if these problematic issues of evil are not even evil, just temporality, just growing old, just change itself. How do these issues match with this ideal picture? The other way of looking at it is the way Gregory looks at it. He doesn't actually look at it that way. He looks at it top down, which is from God's perspective. Because you see, Gregory thinks nothing happens without God's purpose and foreknowledge. So our participation in change is not an accident. It's not something to be explained away. It's part and parcel of God's plan to bring the whole cosmos into participation with him. So top down, why would God allow or be interested in creatures and humanity who have his image, but also have, and Gregory is really specific about it, they share God's decision-making power of free will. Unlike anything in the cosmos, we steer the ship. Why would God do that? And so he's addressing of the question of necessity, change, is not from a negative defensive point of view, because if you look at it, that quickly becomes in traditional theology the problem of sin and how to get rid of sin. This is not a problem. It's intrinsic in the created order that it's changing, that it's created. And that is not a problem God can get rid of, because if he gets rid of it, he gets rid of creation. That's how Gregory thinks. So there's got to be a positive purpose in our participation in these two worlds. And I hope that change of paradigm makes sense to you and sinks in as it's beginning to do to me, because I found that very, very helpful. This chapter he goes in, by the way, Gregory is forensically basing his thinking on Genesis 1, verses 26 and 27. For obvious reasons, I told you what he's doing. He's writing the concluding section of his brother's great work. And he goes a lot into male and femaleness and procreation. And he asks, so around about the 52nd minute of the talk, John comes to the question, well, why did God plan this twofold nature? Well, it's not an accident. It's not a reaction to sin. It's actually intrinsic in Genesis 1. Why the compound nature of humanity? And that section is worth listening to several times. I mean, I'm just slowly absorbing it myself, but it's in that section that Gregory makes his very famous assertion that what we're looking at in Genesis 1 is not Adam, but all humanity templated after the prototype of Christ. That's what we're looking at in Genesis 1. And that the totality of humanity is to bring all of creation into participation into the divine order by lifting it up into the divine. So for them, growth or the choice we have in growth, the moral choice in growth is, do we look up or do we look down? That's actually it. If we look down, we will drag all of creation and we'll drag our sense of the divine into the mud, and we'll be bestial and we'll be sensate and we'll be reactive and we'll behave like beasts. We'll drag it all down. Our job is to drag it up into the heavens. That's what Gregory and his early church father compatriots basically saw. It's a matter of direction. Where do we direct the cosmos? And that starts in our minds, in our faith, in our beliefs. So that is growth. So macro picture is that for creation to participate in God, God can't just declare it. He can't just declare it and say it exists, because it is not participating in God unless it has free will. It's not participating in God unless it's got choice, unless it's got decision, because that's what God does. And we're the only part of creation with that faculty. I mean, that's where our decision-making comes in. That's where our quote-unquote rationality comes in. And hence, the enormous picture of creation is transformations, the word John will end up using to grow up into the image of God. And from a macro point of view, that's what he has in mind. But then, of course, I think quite helpfully, John says, because that picture can be quite bewildering and quite overawing, but nonetheless, in our little lives, we replicate it. We, in our little lives, are advancing or have the choice to advance creation and our part of creation towards that end and purpose. So around about the hour-long section, you've got a beautiful analogy. I don't think Gregory uses the analogy. He uses another one on sculpting, which is pretty good, but John uses one on the caterpillar and butterfly section. So he sort of sums it up that Genesis 1, 26, 27 is the caterpillar. The caterpillar has got all of the template and genetic code to become a butterfly. But it can only become a butterfly by a process of change. So the theological huge picture of Gregory is humanity as a whole, humanity as individuals, cosmos as a whole, moving from caterpillar to butterfly. Well, that's my best shot at giving you a sort of plain English, analogical, semi-poetic version of what you're about to hear. And we'll release John's talk, shortly. Be aware that, and we'll post up for those of you who didn't come to the conference, we'll post up the slides, because John will make a pretty heavy use of Gregory's text. So lots of his talk, he's reading out the text, which in itself is wonderful, but because the prose is pretty packed and dense, it really helps to have it in front of you. I think this is really a theology for the world. Just going back to where we began, Gregory didn't live in a religious hothouse. He had an open mind, and I think his decision to bounce off Plato was inspired and can be a really good role model for us.